4 o'clock in London, and 8 o'clock in Los Angeles. We're making an appeal to gals who are mothers, who have children who are dependent upon them, and who simply can't make ends meet. You have a paycheck and it doesn't come close to paying the budget. And the young man who's trying hard to come up with a family budget and provide for a wife and children, and you could work 40 or 80 or 160 hours and it's just not going to work. And so here we're going to gather our gang together and we're going to ask you, how much of a budget do you need to run the household? You need a household budget to get things started. How much is groceries, and how much is not rent but mortgage? And how much are clothes and medical bills? And how much is dentist? How much is tennis lessons for you? If you're going to do the producing, you get to do the consuming. And that brings us to home economics. Just so it said, we have about 3 dozen half a 6-minute or so anecdotes on a couple of YouTube channels, The Priest and the Pimp and The Priest and the Pimp Media Access. And so here we're going to ramble in the good sense of the word. This is about the 5th time we've gone live, and we're hoping you'll pass the word and get those gals together and start writing in on the live chat and start complaining. We can do something about that as soon as you raise your voice. Let me remind myself here in the States, hopefully this will appeal to gals and guys in Great Britain, because so much of this stuff came out of Great Britain. Judges wear black robes because Catholic priests 500 years ago in England or Great Britain wore black robes. And they used to write laws that would say the priest is a good guy and the pimp is the bad guy. And that's the classic battle of good and evil. People who hustle, con, manipulate, and intimidate people are considered the bad guys. And people who practice virtues, race relegated to an endearing quality of your parents. These thoughts in my mind that have to do with sex have to do with getting the gal pregnant, and I straighten myself up emotionally. And then I will the good of another person, and I do it because Christ rose on the 3rd day. That's the stereotypical shop manual, those 3 things that have to do with God and country. That's what God and country is. It's a Catholic thing. And so one of the things I'll bet you you have to do right now, if you're listening, is to say, okay, the Pope is in charge. The Pope holds the moral high ground, so I choose to put the Pope in charge. And I do, and then suddenly I actually have a sense of free will. I know it is the famous phrase. And I adopt the other nature in us, and I take it from there. I straighten myself up emotionally, and I will the good of another person. And it's not a natural thing, it's an unnatural thing. It goes against our hard wiring. It goes against the chimpanzee side of stuff. So, and you have this desire to shake and shiver and just attack. And that's one of the things we have to get over. We actually know from it's a 4-step process. And the first step is to come up with a course that teaches us. That said, let me remind myself that in the 50s, the communists said they would overthrow the United States in the early to mid 70s, about the year 1973, which also happens to be the year of the highest standard of living as far as the middle class goes. And in philosophy, they did that. They had a sexual revolution. They started making money by causing poverty. They made money by forcing people to have to work more hours. And they did it because they threw out religion and they adopted their own religion. Everything for them. I have to get things out and realize that the things that have to be said out loud, they're famous stuff. They come from Aristotle and Plato and all that stuff. And that is that if there is no Christ, if Christ didn't rise on the 3rd day, if there's these thoughts in your head don't continue on after you die, there isn't that infusion in your mind up there, then being a psychopathic nut, living in the foothills, doing all the consuming while everybody in the valley does all the producing, is the highest standard of living you can have. They do, and the consuming end, you either live in housing projects or slums, a slumlord or a proletariat. Doesn't make one bit of difference. They're they're slumlords, or they're the bourgeois class, or they call themselves a class of intellectuals, which is what is running the show right now. Those university professors and those people in government, and until the other gang takes over, that's who's been running things. And the Catholic Church would refer to them as evil. People who hustle, con, manipulate, and intimidate. It's a classic definition of what the satanic is. In the 1950s, they would refer to them as a bunch of queer scoundrels. And I think they were onto something. I'm sure you, listening to this, did the exact same thing I did. You make a natural, and most people do, you make a natural assumption that people who hustle and con, who stand there and say things such as, sometimes I just like to act like a scoundrel, are inherently the bad guys. That's not the intellectual position. And they don't think twice about forcing you about hurting you. They feel good hurting other people. It's a famous phrase. And so in the 70s in philosophy, they threw out God and country. In psychology, it was a big thing to say the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. They really didn't have a clear idea on what mental illness was, but they decided that homosexuality would no longer be a mental illness. And in doing so, the bum rush there was they threw out those three things that make up God and country. They threw out the idea of being normal and well-adjusted, of being a good husband and wife, a good mother, and a good father, and then a good citizen. That was thrown out. It was literally considered a mental illness if you were a priest or nun, or if you were a common housewife. You were a pig if you're trying to provide for a wife and children. And the people who said that, well, they just cashed in on everything. They would say, as an act of social justice, they get to cash in on everything, and then they go live in the foothills, and then they have children and collect rent from other people, and they're scoundrels, and they got away with it. And not you. They left you with in terrible trouble. Let's continue. In courts came out and said there will be no religion in government, and in doing so, they threw out God and country, the very thing that made the United States such a famous place to live, so unique in the history of human beings on this earth. We, as I mentioned, courts in England, judges wear black robes because courts in England wore black robes. Courts in England used to be Catholic priests, and the whole idea of natural law, which isn't very natural at all, saying that people who hustle are criminals, are the bad guys, and people who practice virtue are pushed up into the top of society. And they threw that out. They did it connivingly, and they did it with a great deal of violence. They threw bombs in the streets. I'm for the violent overthrow of the United States government, says Angela Davis, a university professor. I saw her a few years ago when she was when they had riots in the street, and there she was giving a speech, putting her fist in the air, in her 70s at least, and getting $30,000 a speech for it. And she won whole hands down. They're just getting people to take to the streets and rioting. And Donna Shalala, the first female Surgeon General, if we hadn't got everything we wanted, we would have tore it all down, she says, in talking about the 1968 riots. And Jane Fonda, if people would just try communism, she says, in North Vietnam, sitting on an artillery piece, talking about they had demonstrated in favor of communism against the Vietnam War, and they stopped the American from bombing Cambodia and stopping the supply lines there, the enemy supply lines. And she said, now that we've stopped the bombing, we're on equal footing and we can go to work. In other words, they were fighting for communism, and they were fighting for the intellectuals' government. And take a look. You're supposed to like this, by the way. You're supposed to be a gal who puts her kid in the daycare center and heads off to be a plumber or drive a big rig and pick up the garbage and that sort of thing. And you're supposed to like this. I think there's something wrong because they didn't do that. In the 70s, those gals who are now heads of the university departments and heads of the Treasury Department and upper levels of government, they didn't do anything like that. In fact, they did just the opposite. They decided that they would lord over you, and now you're living in abject poverty. So are your kids. Brings us to home economics. Home economics is the opposite of not home economics. Individual rights is one of the words. Home economics is the opposite of individual rights, to get the thought out. It's not the only phrase they use. Home economics is when the married couple is viewed as the basic economic thing. It's the smallest economic thing. Go up to a computer and pretend to take out a transistor. You take out a third transistor, and as you take out a fourth transistor, it's no longer a computer, it's a pile of electronic parts. You put that transistor back in, it's back to being a computer, and there you go. The family is a base economic unit. 10-year-olds cannot pay for their mommies. Mommies can't take care of the kids and run the house and head out to work. Dads can work and can't do all the chores around the house. And the married couple is viewed as a single person, and that works like a charm. So long as as long as they practice virtues. So picture, that's how you get a detached house from the 1950s, very deliberately designed. It's what gets you out of poverty and into plenty. You have a living room to live in, and a bedroom, and a backyard to play in, and it's the smallest economic thing. And so picture a young couple, hopefully that's you soon, sitting in the living room and in a detached house. Go out to the side, start with farming and mining, then manufacturing, then wholesale retail and repair, and then retirement, education, and recreation. And then doctors and lawyers form a kind of lattice that holds it all together. It's the Catholic priest that causes all of this to come into being to begin with. They maximize benefits and maximize utilities by adopting the leadership style of washing the feet of the apostles. They put curbs on the road, and then now the guy who lives in a house and puts you in your own business makes more money than the guy who owns several businesses. And the guy who's a professional consumer, the communist and fascist, they're the enemy. They're out of here. That all changed. Let's add one more thing to this. When society changed, and if you go back and look, whether it's Great Britain or the United States, there was a huge upheaval. Houses around here went up as much as $2,000 a month. And there was a profound change in our society. They could have rolled in with tanks. They did throw bombs in the street. They won is what it amounts to. And so picture a house, and for that brief moment, that decade or so, the hubby, the quite a scoundrel hubby, could still had a job, and his income still paid the gas and electric bill and the groceries. And so when the gal first entered the workplace, her income was extra income. She actually didn't enter the workplace at all. She was the consumption, and it's called the consumption society. They didn't have to. They could have done that lots of different ways. The gal could have stayed single because married and sex is the physical, taking care of the physical child, and the physical pleasure of sex, and the romance of sex, and the whatever neat emotion is in the Catholic nun, it lines up, and they still could have kept that. They threw it out. In other words, the feminists could have given up sex and given up children, and she could have went and got a job in order to pay the gas bill. She could have been happy living in a condo. Houses are for the married couple, and a condo is for the single guys and gals, and you own it. She should have been very happy. They didn't do that. They did just the opposite. Well, let's go back because I drifted a bit. Hubby made an income and still paying the bills. The gal got a job, and suddenly they have all this extra income at the moment. It's just a paper called a dollar bill or a British pound. And so what did they do? They went out and got into a duplex and started renting property out to other people. And the only people they had to rent out was rent houses to were people who had an income but were at the lower part of that income. They could have normally bought a house, but now they have to rent. And right there it happened, the thin edge of a wedge. And you go look, it'll look just like the letter, the lazy V on its side, just like that. And these people up here became the upper class of feminists, the Harry the hippie and Al the Afro and Donna the Dyke. And these people down here plunged into poverty. That's you. That's the gal who lives in housing projects. That's the gal, you can name them. Gal who works at an office, and she makes so much money. And by the time she finishes paying rent, she doesn't have any money for groceries. And she has to put her child into a daycare center. And she's scrambling to try and come up with enough money to pay the daycare center in order to have somebody else raise her child. No, she can't do it. And she can't do it. Neither can you and a whole class of people now. Let me go back. So that family income, that guy and gal who were scoundrels went out and got in a duplex, and they might have invested in something like a hamburger franchise that was popular. They would invest in hamburger franchises. They would hire somebody to run it, manage it, and they institutionalized teenagers back in the workplace, what you mentioned. In other words, they formed a peasant and property class society. Now, their world, the world where courts came out and said you can have no religion in government, and this world, the magical world that the United States had going, that was so rare and that they threw out, well, one of us is committing treason. It's not this camp. And so when you talk about this stuff, don't kid yourself. It all started, it'll all go back to around the 70s, the 60s going into the 70s. And one of us has committed treason. And it isn't you. You're starving because of this. You're going to be in dire straits because of it. It's just going to get worse. I'm sure they'll do the right thing, right? This idea of reparations, the way they say it, is a lot of nonsense. But we'll have the good kind of reparations. As an example, just to be candidly honest, you ask yourself, what's wrong? What do you do about it? And how do you do it? And well, it's a 4-step process. You first teach a sense of original sin. Perhaps somebody out there can come up with a 16-week, week 1, day 1, hour 1 course that teaches you first a sense of original sin, then how to stand up to a cheap pimp. And then the other 3 are straightforward. Here in the United States, they're the ones that committed treason. It's straight out of the books. You stop and grab your 3-cornered hat. You go downtown to the Supreme Court, and I'm sure they'll stand down, and I'm sure won't be violent. Yeah, and I'm sure they'll get a garbage sack and go start picking up garbage in slums. I'm sure they'll go form a class of economics beneath the class of poverty that they caused. I don't believe a word I just said, but that's what you would do. Here in Tucson, where this is being videoed, you would get your gang together, a gang of Yanks. We need a British word for that. And you would go down to the courts, and I'm sure they would happily remove themselves, knowing that between here and the very short 2 miles to the court's houses, you would have to walk around somebody's living room if you're walking down the sidewalk. There are people living in the streets here now. You just never saw that. Those judges and those intellectuals at the university caused that. But then you pull a fast one. just to get things out and be honest, instead of taking over the place and getting yourself a Cuban cigar and a hat, you go and find those poor slobs of a criminal trial attorney that defends the poor and the oppressed, and you sort of throw a bucket of icy cold water on them, and then everything changes. I insist that that attorney, the caring character who goes out and defends us all, I insist that he lives in a doctor and lawyer house, and that he drives a Corvette and flies jets as a weekend warrior, and he's going to take Wednesdays off and play in that silly tennis tournament they have, whether he likes it or not. I will the good of another person. Once I get that far out, and we're there. And then, just as said, you would walk over to the University of Arizona, and which is a very short mile. And I'm sure most of the university professors, most of the departments so many of the departments could disappear. The level, the standard of living in the United States would pop, or in Tucson would pop right up. I'm sure they'll do the same thing. I'm sure they'll stop what they're doing and go start picking up the garbage that they caused. And then you replace them with a college of home economics. We're so desperate for a college of home economics. It's silly. And that's you. That's you, the gal who's listening to this. That's phase one. And then phase two, you go between Tucson and Tombstone and set the ladders straight. You have our own reparations. If you go north from the University of Arizona, you run into a growing slum. This house is in that. This house was built right around 1950. This is the house I grew up in, and our dad was a repairman. There was a milkman a couple doors down, and a plumber, and a guy who worked in a feed store. And the guy who built the neighborhood, one guy built one house and one guy built another, and they built houses for themselves. There was a doctor and lawyer neighborhood about down the road a bit, and this was what used to be called a working class neighborhood. This was something that nobody could afford in any other part of the world, not even in Europe if you were a repairman, but you could here. And so you, the gal, you were a professional citizen, and you were a professional, you took up a housewife as a profession. You had the identity of an American Yank, a normal, well-adjusted person, straight out of Aristotle and Plato, and straight out of Christ. He's the one that put a dot on the letter I. And then things worked out. We had this huge middle class. Well, we have, it's been closing in on 25 minutes. We'll keep it up a little, but remember, the whole point of these live broadcasts is to get you to go out. If you know a gal with a couple of teenagers and you're wondering how in the world you're going to get them to a dentist, and this is ridiculous, now you're asking teenagers to go out and work in order to help pay the bills. Just so I said, if you're a guy, to get things out, you ask yourself how many hours you have to work. And going from the 70s to today, if you had a job that actually produced things, you had to work more hours and more hours than you and your wife had to work. And now you and your wife and the kids often have to work. If you went the other way, you don't rent property to people, you don't rent property from people, so long as you're a Yank or so you're a home economist. Mrs. Miniver, if you're in England or Great Britain. And things change in a very big way. The only people that don't like this are the people with no sense of love and no sense of guilt in them, those university professors, and those people, the communists. Communists are fascists. So you come over here, please. You go find those gals. That's you. You show up and start saying, this is how much money I need to run a household budget. And this is how many hours I have to work. If I live in Tollsbury and I'm running a forklift in a factory, I need to know how many hours you have to work. We'll start putting two and two together, and we could do something. And that same as you in St. Louis and you in Los Angeles. Once you get this far, once you start gathering your gang together, and you can do something about it. So what's wrong? They threw out God and country. What do I do about it? Well, I go back to God and country. I go to the courts and change it back to what would be the Apostles' Creed. And then that would be phase one in the rest of government. And then phase two, you go between Tucson and Tombstone, and you have our own version of reallocating wealth. And then stage three, you have home economics. You picture a household unit, you go off to, you know the drill, and then you get to work. You build, demand, build until we get to a maintenance level. Till there's a chicken in every pot in a car and a car in every garage. Well, please pass the word, and we'll see you on Fridays and Saturdays at 11 o'clock California time. Let's see, that would be 2 o'clock New York time, and 7 o'clock London time, and on Fridays and Saturdays, and then on Sundays at 8 o'clock Los Angeles, and 11 o'clock New York, and 4 o'clock on London time. Come on, get up, go to work. We'll see you. Oh, excuse me, one last thing. I forgot, I'm going to try and put the other videos on one YouTube channel. I'm going to try to put an email address. So if you know anybody, you can please type in, look, this is how much a dentist costs. This is how much, this is what we need to get going here. And once you do that, you can do something about it. Good luck.